Why mythology is more real than science. Jung on psychological truth. Have you ever wondered why certain stories seem to resonate so deeply with us? Why ancient myths, tales of heroes and monsters, gods and demons, continue to captivate us thousands of years after they were first told? I used to think mythology was just primitive science. Early humans' way of explaining natural phenomena they didn't understand. Lightning strikes. Must be Zeus throwing thunderbolts. Volcano erupts. Probably Hephaestus at his forge. Simple explanations for a pre-scientific world. But then I discovered the work of Carl Jung and everything changed. What if these ancient myths weren't failed attempts at science, but something else entirely? What if they were revealing profound psychological truths that modern science, for all its precision and power, often completely misses? Let me share something that blew my mind. You know the story of Icarus, right? The young man who flew too close to the sun with his wax wings, fell into the sea, and drowned. As a kid, I thought this was just a primitive explanation for a drowning accident, or maybe a creative way to warn children about disobedience. But Jung saw something much deeper. He recognized that myths like Icarus contain psychological truths that speak directly to our unconscious. The story isn't about literal flight. It's about human hubris, about what happens when we become inflated with our own importance and ignore natural limitations. It's a pattern that plays out in human life over and over again. Science can tell us how gravity works, but it can't capture the emotional reality of overreaching and falling. Mythology does that beautifully. It gives form to our inner experiences in a way that scientific explanations simply can't. Think about it. Have you ever had someone try to explain away your feelings with scientific facts? Maybe you're going through a devastating breakup, and a well-meaning friend tells you, well, actually, those feelings are just neurochemical reactions in your limbic system. Technically true, but completely misses the point, right? The science doesn't capture your lived experience. This is where Jung's insight becomes so profound. He realized that myths aren't failed science. They're addressing an entirely different kind of truth. Science tells us how the physical world operates. Mythology tells us how the inner world operates. Both are essential forms of knowledge. I remember when this really clicked for me. I was going through what you might call a dark night of the soul. That midlife period where everything you thought you knew about yourself and your life suddenly seems inadequate. I was lost, confused, questioning everything. Science could explain the neurological and hormonal aspects of what I was experiencing. It could tell me about stress responses and perhaps even prescribe medications. But what really helped me make sense of my experience was the ancient mythological pattern of the hero's journey, the descent into the underworld, the death and rebirth cycle, the transformation through trials. These mythological patterns gave meaning to my suffering in a way that scientific explanations simply couldn't. The myth didn't just describe what was happening, it helped me navigate it. Jung discovered that these mythological patterns appear across all cultures, throughout all of human history. He called them archetypes, universal templates in the human psyche that shape how we experience life. The hero, the mother, the trickster, the shadow. These aren't just characters in old stories. They're psychological realities that live within each of us. Let me give you another example. Think about the myth of the dragon-slaying hero. This story appears in virtually every culture on Earth. St. George and the dragon, Perseus and the sea monster, Sigurd and Fafnir in Norse mythology, and countless others. Science would say these are just fictional stories, products of imagination. But Jung saw something deeper. The dragon, he realized, represents the terrifying challenges we must face to grow. The hero represents our conscious self, venturing into the unknown. The treasure guarded by the dragon symbolizes the psychological rewards of confronting our fears rather than avoiding them. When I understood this, I started seeing the dragon-slaying pattern everywhere in real life. The student facing the terror of public speaking to advance academically. The person confronting a painful truth about themselves to heal a relationship. The artist facing the blank canvas and the fear of failure. Science can't capture these patterns of human experience, but mythology does so perfectly. The myth isn't primitive at all. It's speaking a profound psychological truth that's as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. This is why Jung believed mythology is, in a very real sense, more true than science when it comes to understanding the human experience. Science excels at explaining the objective, external world. But mythology captures the subjective, internal world where we actually live our lives. You know what's fascinating? Modern neuroscience is actually catching up to what Jung understood intuitively. Researchers have discovered that the human brain processes information through narrative. We make sense of our experiences by organizing them into stories. Our brains are literally wired for mythology. I saw this play out dramatically with a friend who was struggling with addiction. All the scientific information about dopamine receptors and brain chemistry wasn't helping him. What finally clicked was when he encountered the archetypal story of the hero's journey. The call to adventure, the trials, the transformation. Suddenly, his struggle had meaning. He wasn't just a broken machine needing repair. He was on a profound journey of transformation. The science was accurate but incomplete. The mythology provided a framework that engaged his whole being. Not just his rational mind, but his emotions, his imagination, his sense of purpose and meaning. Jung would say, this is because mythology speaks the language of the unconscious, the vast part of our mind that operates below the level of conscious awareness. The unconscious doesn't communicate in logical propositions or statistical analyses. It speaks in images, symbols, and stories. It speaks the language of mythology. This is why dreams often have a mythological quality to them. In dreams, we might fly without wings, speak with the dead, or transform into animals. Things that are impossible according to science, but perfectly natural in the realm of myth. Our dreams are the unconscious mind communicating in its native language. Science struggles to engage with this dimension of human experience. It can observe brain activity during dreams, but it can't tell you what your dreams mean. For that, we need a different kind of knowledge, the symbolic wisdom contained in mythology. I remember working with a young man who was having recurring nightmares about being chased by a terrifying shadow figure. Science might reduce this to anxiety or a stress response, but Jung would recognize this as an encounter with the shadow archetype, the disowned parts of ourselves that we've rejected or suppressed. When we explored his dream through this mythological lens, the young man realized he had been running from aspects of himself: his anger, his power, his ambition, that he had been taught were bad. By understanding the mythological pattern, he could stop running and begin integrating these rejected parts, becoming more whole in the process. No scientific explanation could have provided this path to healing. The mythological understanding revealed a truth that science simply couldn't access. Now, I'm not suggesting we should reject science. That would be absurd. Science has given us incredible insights and technologies that have transformed human life for the better. What Jung recognized is that we need both scientific truth and mythological truth. They address different dimensions of reality. Think of it like this. Science is like describing the physical structure and chemical properties of a cake. Mythology is like describing how it tastes. Both are true, but they're different kinds of truth. And if you really want to understand the cake, you need both perspectives. The problem arises when we try to reduce all truth to scientific truth, what philosophers call scientism. This view suggests that if something can't be measured and quantified, it isn't real or important. But this dismisses the entire subjective dimension of human experience. Our feelings, meanings, values, and purposes, the very things that make life worth living. Jung understood that mythology preserves knowledge about this subjective dimension. The ancient myths weren't just making up stories. They were recording hard-won insights about the patterns of human experience. Insights that remain profoundly relevant today. I experienced this personally when dealing with grief after losing a loved one. Science could explain the stages of grief and the neurological processes involved. But what really helped me navigate that dark landscape was the ancient mythological motif of the descent to the underworld, found in stories like Orpheus and Eurydice, Inanna's descent, or Persephone in Hades. These myths taught me that grief isn't just a problem to be solved or a condition to be treated. It's a necessary journey into the depths, a transformation that changes you forever. The myths didn't just describe grief, they gave it meaning and purpose. In a society increasingly dominated by scientific and technological thinking, we're losing touch with this mythological dimension. We've become incredibly sophisticated at manipulating the external world, but increasingly illiterate when it comes to navigating our inner world. Jung believed this disconnect is at the root of many modern psychological problems. When we lose touch with the mythological dimension, we lose access to the wisdom our ancestors encoded in these stories. We try to live by science alone and find ourselves in a world that feels meaningless and disenchanted. You can see this in the rise of depression and anxiety disorders, in the epidemic of loneliness, in the widespread sense of purposelessness that afflicts so many people in modern societies. We have more scientific knowledge than any generation in history, yet we struggle to find meaning in our lives. This is why Jung advocated for a reclaiming of mythology, not as an alternative to science, but as its essential complement. He believed we need both the objective truth of science and the psychological truth of mythology if we are to live whole, meaningful lives. I remember a scientist friend who scoffed at mythological thinking. "I deal in facts, not fantasies," he told me proudly. But then, His marriage fell apart, and all his scientific knowledge couldn't help him understand what had happened or how to heal. It was only when he began to see his experience through the lens of ancient mythological patterns, death and rebirth, the encounter with the shadow, the hero's journey, that he could make sense of his pain and find a path forward. The myth provided a truth that his science couldn't access, a truth about the archetypal patterns that shape human relationships, about the necessity of loss for growth, about the integration of opposing forces within the psyche. What's particularly fascinating is how mythology connects us to our ancestors and to our shared humanity. When I read a myth from ancient Greece, or hear a Native American folk tale, or study a story from Chinese mythology, I'm struck by how recognizable the emotional patterns are. Despite vast differences in culture and historical context, these stories speak to common human experiences: love, loss, courage, transformation. Science tends to emphasize what makes us different: our unique genetic makeup, our specific neurological wiring. Mythology reveals what makes us the same: our shared emotional landscapes, our common psychological challenges. In a world that often feels increasingly fragmented and divided, this shared mythological inheritance reminds us of our fundamental connection to one another. I once attended a workshop where people from different cultural backgrounds shared their traditional myths. What struck me was how participants would nod in recognition when hearing a story from a culture completely different from their own. "Yes, we have a story like that too," they would say. The details might vary, but the essential psychological pattern was immediately recognizable. Jung called this the collective unconscious, the idea that beneath our personal experiences lies a deeper layer of shared psychological patterns common to all humanity. Modern science tends to be skeptical of such claims, preferring to emphasize environmental and cultural factors. But the remarkable similarities in mythological motifs across completely unconnected cultures suggest Jung might have been onto something profound. Think about the flood myth, for instance. From Noah's Ark to the Epic of Gilgamesh, to indigenous stories from the Americas, Australia, and Asia, cultures that had no contact with each other, all developed strikingly similar narratives about a great flood that destroys the world, with only a few survivors remaining to rebuild civilization. Science might explain this as separate responses to actual local flooding events, or perhaps as cultural diffusion. But Jung would see something deeper, a universal psychological pattern about the cycles of destruction and renewal that characterize both nature and human society. The flood myth isn't just about water. It's about how we experience profound change and upheaval in our lives. Another fascinating aspect of mythology is how it helps us integrate opposing forces in our psyche. Science typically works by categorizing and separating. Mythology works by connecting and reconciling. Think about the countless mythological figures who embody seemingly contradictory qualities. Gods who are both creators and destroyers. Trickster figures who bring both chaos and innovation. Heroes who contain both nobility and fatal flaws. These complex figures reflect the reality of our inner lives much more accurately than the neat categories of scientific classification. We are all, as Walt Whitman put it, contradictory. We contain multitudes. Mythology gives us models for integrating these contradictions rather than trying to eliminate them. I see this in my own life all the time. Part of me wants stability and routine. Another part craves adventure and novelty. Science might label these as different personality traits or competing neural networks, but mythology gives me images like the god Janus with his two faces, or the Chinese concept of yin and yang. Models that help me understand these tensions not as problems to solve, but as energies to balance. This integrative function of mythology is particularly valuable in our hyper-specialized modern world. Science, for all its strengths, tends to fragment our understanding into ever more specialized domains. We have experts in cardiology who know little about neurology, physicists who don't understand biology, social scientists who can't speak the language of quantum mechanics. This specialization has enabled tremendous advances, but it comes at the cost of a unified vision of reality. Mythology, by contrast, is integrative. It connects the cosmic with the personal, the physical with the spiritual, the objective with the subjective. It gives us narratives that make sense of our place in the larger scheme of things, something that fragmented scientific knowledge often fails to provide. I think this is why so many people turn to mythology, often unconsciously, when facing life's biggest challenges. Whether it's through religious narratives, modern retellings of ancient stories, or even the mythological structures embedded in popular films and novels, we seek out these patterns that help us make meaning of our experiences. Jung understood that mythology isn't something we outgrow as we become more scientifically sophisticated. Rather, it's an essential complement to scientific knowledge, one that addresses dimensions of human experience that science alone cannot capture. The most psychologically healthy individuals I know aren't those who have rejected either science or mythology. They're those who have found ways to honor both, using science to understand the objective world and mythology to navigate the subjective one. They're people who can analyze data and interpret dreams, who value both logic and symbolism, who can think critically while also remaining open to mystery. In our increasingly complex and challenging world, we need both these forms of knowledge more than ever. We need the precision and power of science to tackle concrete problems, and we need the wisdom and meaning of mythology to guide us through the inevitable dark nights of the soul that all humans face. So the next time you encounter an ancient myth, don't dismiss it as primitive superstition. Look deeper. Ask what psychological truth it might be revealing. Because as Jung discovered, these old stories aren't just relics of a pre-scientific past. They're maps of the human soul, as relevant and powerful today as they were thousands of years ago. Because ultimately, mythology isn't less real than science. It's simply addressing a different kind of reality, the subjective reality we each live in every day. And in that inner landscape, the psychological truths of mythology are often more real than any scientific fact could ever be.